Hello, hello, welcome to the stream, everybody. So, tonight I am taking another crack at England. Those of you who watched my first stream will know that my first England game went disastrously bad because I was very rusty. But after a few weeks of this, I think I've dusted off my EU4 skill set well enough and learned some of the new mechanics that have been added that I think I'm ready to take another crack at it. So away we go. And I'm excited because tonight I get to rep a Maryland distillery. I am currently drinking the 1812 blend by the Twin Valley Distillery. It is spectacular. Uh, Not looking for any product placement. Yeah, I'm actually this is a run I'm gonna do to the end. The past few I've kind of been dusting off. I used to be really good at this game, and then I didn't play it for quite a while until I started this stream back up. So I've kind of been refamiliarizing myself with a lot of this stuff, but I think I'm ready to do a whole game all the way through now. But yeah, definitely pick yourselves up a bottle from that distillery. It is really good. 90 proof. It's a bit stronger than what I'm used to, but spectacular all the same. So we need a few extra seats in Parliament. 6, 7, and 8. I believe it is. Yep, right here in the middle of Wales. Alright, now time to. Well, I've got that disaster to worry about, but going to focus on that. Wait, did France not rival me? Alright, so they didn't apparently. Huh. First time I've seen that happen. I suppose I do. Yeah, this is the first England game I've ever played where France didn't rival me. Okay. There we go. Now to handle my estates. I've actually only got two to worry about. Oh, I don't want to do that. Wine, wool, get some money right off the bat. Glass, textiles, private trade fleets, and free enterprise. Perfect. Should be easy for me to get my hands on some land now. And I'll beef up this army too. Alright, so already off to a more promising start than my first England game. And I'll expand that to 10 because I have OCD and I like nice round numbers. Build a few more ships as well. And we're doing mission expanded because that's way more fun. I will take that royal marriage, Portugal. If we can avoid the War of the Roses, that would be spectacular. And I'm going to vassalize Ireland through Leinster, so royal marry them. Yeah, no, I only need the one ally, so you go away, Ulster, and I don't really need Aragon. Improve relations? Why does France... No, you go away, France. Rival the nobles. And we have claims on Ireland now. But I want to wait until this France situation is resolved before I do that. Okay, and we are raking in money. Never a problem with England. Speaking of, I should probably hire some advisors. Diplo rep and national unrest. There we go. I'm not interested in buying followers. I'd rather do this organically. There we go. All right, so still got that disaster hanging over our heads, but we'll get that dealt with. All right, what do we do here? Let's just abandon the continent. Usually the best way to play England, so I'm not even going to put up a fight on land. Just have my navy block theirs, so I don't have to worry about them invading the mainland. So yeah, once they take my continental provinces, I'll just give them up. It's the only real option here. Especially the new patches have made it almost impossible to win the Hundred Years' War. There used to be some ways you could cheese it as England, and you really can't anymore. So I will take the L. Probably best to. How do I do that? Oh, we got a free stability. There we go. There we go. Thank you. All right, get him out of here. There we go. Thank you for that. Yeah, I get those offers every so often on SoundCloud too, and I'm not paying for it. I think my content's good enough to stand on its own 2 feet. Yeah, we're just gonna, as soon as we can, just ditch this. So offer. What if we just give them? If the 27th, there will be. Usually they do if they're releasing new DLC. Is that when Leviathan comes out? If so, then yeah, there will probably be a good discount on it. I've seen it last. I have seen discounts that high. I just can't remember if it was a DLC release. Sometimes you're lucky and like a Steam and like a big release coincides with a Steam deal, and you can make out like a bandit, really. Alright, gotta delete 7 regiments. But I would definitely check in if you're looking to download some DLC. There are a few good videos on YouTube that go into like essential DLCs. Like the differentiating from the ones that are just like slight content alterations or boosts, and the ones that legitimately improve the game quite a bit. Go for it, dude. Let me know how it works out for you. But yeah, they're pretty regular. I know. I mean, summer's coming, and Steam usually has a few good discounts over the summer. Margaret of Anjou. Hmm. If I remember right, she was actually the historical basis for Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones. How close are we? I'll just do War of the Roses now that I don't have to worry about the French, and I will take that free power. I got you. Yeah, no. Paradox's DLC policy is garbage. They make some great games, but the way they release them, honestly, it keeps a lot of people out of them. And I'm going to take advantage of this before I lose my great power status. Okay, looks like our diet is disabled. That's something I didn't realize about the English monarchy. But we're still off to a decent start here. Especially because France is already not something we gotta worry about. I will delete this fort down here, because the only real risk will come from Burgundy. And I'm going to separate out. There we go. You guys go to Ireland. That is target number one. And vassalize. Right, so this period in England, the War of the Roses kind of threw a wrench in everything. But this was England's more or less recovery, at least in the 15th century, was its recovery from a century of warfare with France, during which time it actually lost control over the vast majority of Ireland, which it did used to control. The English influence over Ireland dates all the way back to the the original Anglo-Norman conquerors. There was a man called Strongbow, which is a pretty fucking metal name for a conqueror, if you ask me, who invaded Ireland and established this region called the Pale, which this expresses correctly, but it's the region largely centered on Dublin, which rose to prominence because it's some of the richest farmland, not only in Ireland, but honestly the whole of the British Isles. And it was extremely valuable for the Normans to hang on to. And it's actually where the origin of the phrase "beyond the pale" comes from, because going beyond it, they were nothing but local Irishmen who didn't much care for the English, and typically did not go very well for a lot of English people that went beyond the pale. The great irony is that the English tried to cast the, oh, we have an heir, he kind of sucks, but we have an heir. All right, now we just got to kill my king. Um, yeah, I can't take that prestige hit. But anyway, the great irony of this period is that the English did essentially cast the Irish off as a bunch of dirty heathens living on that island over there, which ironically the only reason the English were Christian in the first place was due to the Irish, because when the Anglo-Saxons invaded in like the 5th or 6th century and established the Heptarchy, they were pagans. They worshipped more or less the same gods that the Vikings did. And it was due to Irish missionaries coming over from the monasteries all over the island um, that converted the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. And then many centuries later, when the Normans are in control of the kingdom, they invade Ireland and try to cast off the Christianizers of England as heathens, which is just shows you how effective propaganda can be, especially with the people that, well, most people weren't particularly educated back then, so it's probably a bit easier to convince them that history didn't go down like it did. Um, I mean, you'll find that a lot throughout history, but a very prominent example of it was English propaganda about the Irish. It got doubled down after the English converted to Protestantism, and then they did legitimately consider the Catholics to be heathens, or heretics. So added a bit more bite to that propaganda. But the conquest of Ireland should be pretty easy for us, especially considering that they usually only ally one another, unless they ally Scotland, which can be painful, so we want to avoid that. Allied to awfully. Yeah, let's go after it. And we'll take Cork, thank you very much. That's what I was hoping people would think. But yeah, I thought I could add some unique perspective to EU4 and games like it. And actually, speaking of England in this game, I'm actually that is something that would be interesting to do. So this is kind of related to what I'm going to be writing about for the blog tomorrow. I have a blog that accompanies my podcast um, about the establishment of Anglo-Saxon England, which is Anglo-Saxon is where we get English from. So when the Anglo-Saxons came over from the continent, they tended to settle along the eastern parts of what is now England, and they drove the native Celts into Wales. So Wales and the Welsh are the essentially the original inhabitants of southern Britain. At least culturally speaking, they are much closer to the insular Celts from ages past. So there are a few different. I don't, but I do very much like the Anglo-Saxons. In college, my specialization was East Asia, actually, but since college, I have done a hell of a lot of reading on the medieval era. So, early medieval period is very much my wheelhouse. But the interesting thing about Wales as a country is, yeah, let's learn a different language. Is that the name Wales actually means foreigner in the old language of the Anglo-Saxons. So they effectively became foreigners in their own homeland. It is. Part of the thing that I really enjoy about it is how different it is from our politics today, right? So, wait, what's going on over here? Oh, okay, they got onto the island. Well, Send these guys north. With any luck... Oh, well, I can't send him because he's sieging something. But the thing I really like about the medieval period is how personal it is. Um, Kingdoms would often rise and fall on the charisma and ability of a single person. Ah, damn it. Alright, well, we got a rebellion to deal with. Oh, yeah, definitely. And that's what I'm hoping to do with this series, at least, is lend people a bit of historical depth to historical games. And actually, I have this mod on called The History of Europe that, if we show the province, it gives you the history of each province in the game in Europe at least up to the game start. So if you ever wanted to learn about different cities across Europe, that is a fantastic mod. All right, this siege in Ireland is going forever. Um, but actually, speaking of the going back to the legacy of the Irish invasions the English invasions of Ireland, you can actually go visit Strongbow's grave today. He's buried in Dublin Cathedral. All right, let's send you over there. And all right, so I will take this and give it to Leinster. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. And I'll take your money. Thank you. All right, so vassals, grant province. Can I grant them King's County? I can't. I will grant them the Pale, and then I will grant them King's County. There we go. All right. That is also true. Like, alternate history is a hell of a lot of fun for me. I mean, as a historian, but the thing I like about that mod is that it's up to game start, so it doesn't take into account any of your actions. Just let you know what state, how that province got to where it is at game start, which I thought was interesting. Actually, as far as alternate history goes, I also have a fantastic mod on that um, alters the names of colonial provinces to make them what they would be if they had been conquered by different cultures. No, you're not becoming a march, buddy. Um, hmm, I want to say it's called like I have a mod list. Someone clipped it a few weeks ago. Oh, that's a flag mod that gives you more historically accurate flags. So as England, you get St. George's Cross, which was much more a symbol of England. So the English flag you get in the base game, in the vanilla game, is a relatively recent creation of the later kings of Anglo-Norman England who wanted to assert their rightful claim to the throne of France. Hence, you get the fleur-de-lis and the Lion of England in a checker. But historically, and even today, the national flag of England is St. George's Cross. And that's a yeah, so the symbol of England during the wars of the later medieval era is what the flag is in the base game. Yeah. So that was I might be getting this wrong. Late medieval is not my specialty, but because the fleur de lis is a very ancient symbol of France that dated back at least to the Carolingians, maybe even before. Um, it shows up frequently in French heraldry. It's associated with the Virgin Mary, which is another reason why the French really liked it. But it's sort of a symbol of France. And given the connection the Anglo Norman kings had with France and their assertions to their rightful rule over it, they used the flag as sort of propaganda to reinforce what they viewed as their claim. So, again, I could be getting this wrong, but part of the reason for the conflict was the King of England was the son of a princess of France. Under English law, women could inherit titles from their father, and those titles could pass down. Under French law, that was not the case. Under French Salic law, only males could inherit titles. So, oh, they did. It was a dynastic thing, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong, though. But the Medicis did marry into the royal line of France once or twice. But yeah, the flag of England you see in the base game is it was a very briefly the flag of England, only really during the Hundred Years' War, when the English kings wanted to assert that they had a legitimate claim to the throne of France. I gotcha. Um, but if you go way back in English history, it's St. George's Cross. That goes back to the Anglo-Saxons. And it's also the centerpiece of the modern Union Jack flag. Because the Union Jack is a combination of the Ayrshire, which is St. Andrew's Cross, St. George's Cross, and St. Patrick's Cross, which is a it's basically this flag but with a red cross on a white field. Um, all three of them together, you get the Union Jack. And St. Patrick's Cross was what they used for the Kingdom of Ireland, although the Irish don't use that as a symbol for obvious reasons. Actually, the symbol of Ireland is featured here. It's Brian Boru's harp. Brian Boru was the man who almost united the Irish, and I want to say the 11th century. Almost did it, but ultimately failed. And that was part of Ireland's problem is its political structure. Because it was never conquered by the Romans, they never developed the sort of unified political body that they needed to resist a larger kingdom overseas. Um, so, I can screw over Denmark. I will do that. So Ireland was historically divided between four or five kingdoms at any given point. You have Ulster in the north, Connacht in the west, Desmond in the south, although it did also go by Munster, and then you have Leinster here and Meath here. Yeah, I agree with you. So, a lot of the changes to history are just trying to make the game more playable. For example, the HRE would have just looked disgusting if you did it historically, and it would probably melt most computers you tried to run it on, because we're talking hundreds of states and microstates in here. So most of their historical changes were just to make the game a bit more playable for people who aren't like total history dorks like me. But I still quite enjoy it. And I think, yeah, no, the HRE was a spectacular mess. Let me see if I can find a map for you. It looked even more gross than it does in the game in terms of border gore. Almost got it. Yeah, here we go. You can see this. It is the HRE was just a mess. Yeah, there would be way too much detail if they did it 100% historically accurate. So I understand the changes they made. They consolidated those smaller states into some of the larger and more important ones. I mean, some of these states were effectively just city states. And honestly, it's the same deal with Italy. There were a lot of much smaller city-states up in the north here that don't get included because they weren't historically all that important, and they tended to get conquered and absorbed into the larger states anyway. But generally, the game is pretty accurate until you press the play button. Uh, Lucca, Siena, they get mentioned in this, but there are other, even tinier cities that were sort of in their orbit that were independent for a little while, or at least semi independent. Sort of like how, I mean, going back to the Greek Golden Age. Yeah, so a lot of what Italy was during the Renaissance was alliances and influence between the larger cities. So you have major powerhouses like Milan and Florence and Venice that had smaller cities in their sphere of influence, even though they might not have directly controlled them. Um, so you might have a group of cities that are effectively under Venice's control, but they still maintain some local governance. So can you really say they were part of Venice? They didn't have any voting rights in its republic, so maybe, maybe not. Honestly, it depends on who you ask. Yes, especially in this period, and it was a large part of why you saw the Protestant Reformation. Um, Fun fact here, the donation of Constantine that they used to get the Papal States is actually a forgery. Constantine never consigned these lands to the papacy. Realistically, the reason the Papal State existed is because Charlemagne basically conquered most of what had been the Western Roman Empire. But he was ruling over an incredibly diverse group of people who were only really unified by the fact that they were all Christian. So he needed the Pope as much as the Pope needed him. So it was practical to give the Pope his own bit of land in Italy that he could use as his personal fief, and then he would sort of nominally be a vassal of Charlemagne. Because Charlemagne only got his crown as the Holy Roman Emperor because of the papacy. And this is something you actually see developing. So technically, yes, he did get the title of Emperor of the Romans, even though his capital was usually in Aachen, and he only went to Rome like once or twice during his entire life. But he was technically the first Holy Roman Emperor because he was given the title Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. Because he had, at that point he had united the Frankish kingdoms, and he had married his way into the throne of Italy, and then conquered it. But yeah, he was the first emperor of the HRE. The problem was that when he died, his son Louis the Pious was yeah, but there were a lot of people in Greece who really took exception to that idea. Um, but yeah, so Charlemagne. Um, Sorry, hold on. I got a mission completed. I'm trying to find out where it is. Here we go. English exploration. Oh, we got some colonial range. Nice. And we need to boost our stability. Right. So when Charlemagne died, his son Louis the Pious was a fraction of the man he was. He was an okay administrator, but when it came to his father's visionary rule, nowhere close. Charlemagne basically held Western Europe together by the sheer force of his own personality, and Louis the Pious didn't have it. So, when Louis the Pious dies, Francia gets split between three of his sons, and none of them get the title Emperor of the Romans, because none of them hold that sort of gravitas. You have West Francia, which eventually becomes France. You have Italy, which uh, more or less remains somewhat independent until the Germans show up. Lotharingia, which existed roughly here, and then East Francia, which is most of what is now Germany. So, over time, these kingdoms drifted apart as the Carolingians died off and were replaced by new dynasties. It isn't until you get to, I believe it was, I'm blanking on his dynasty, but Otto the First. Um, so, the Western Roman Empire fell apart due to the barbarian invasions. Um, yeah, so the Franks were actually one of many federati kingdoms which were basically Germanic tribes that the Romans settled within their territory to act as essentially vassal states. They provided military support, and the Romans provided them with land. But the Franks were one of them that managed to gain a lot of power. So as the Roman Empire in Italy started to fall apart internally, these federati kingdoms kind of strike out on their own and go from being vassals to being independent states. The Franks end up conquering most of what had been the Western Roman Empire. Hispania belongs to the Visigoths until the Muslims show up, and Italy goes to the Ostrogoths. But actually, in Italy, a lot of the old imperial structures remain, so you still have a Roman Senate for quite a while in Italy. The Eastern Romans did eventually reconquer Italy as well as most of northern Africa and even parts of Hispania, but it couldn't last. So after that, Italy becomes a kingdom of the Lombards, who were another Germanic people who invaded from somewhere in the forests of Germany. I forget exactly where they came from, but so the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths both came from here actually. So originally, they were Germanic tribes that came from what is today northern Poland. So the Visigoths migrated down to the Crimea in roughly the second and third centuries, and then another migration happens where they move west, and the Visigoths especially raise hell in Greece. Um, and the Visigoths eventually work their way all the way out to Spain, which is where they establish their kingdom. And the Ostrogoths hang out in the Balkans for a little while before conquering Italy. Yeah, it was. It was, and think about it. They did most of this on foot with women and children in tow. Um, but that's kind of how things went back then. You just had massive migrations of people, especially during that period. So once the Byzantines sort of recede back to the core of their territory, Italy falls to the Lombards, who establish a new kingdom of Italy. And then Charlemagne marries slash conquers his way into being the king of Italy, and he unites the Frankish kingdoms as well as Italy into his empire. And that splinters largely because of succession law. So Charlemagne only had one son who was his legitimate successor. He had other sons, he had bastards, and he had sons who were disinherited. But only Louis the Pious was his actual. Also, yeah, Attila the Hun was a driving force behind some of the Germanic migration as well. But Charlemagne only has one son who can effectively inherit his empire, which he does. And then Louis the Pious has three sons and I believe a grandson who all inherit. And that's how the Frankish Empire splits into its constituent kingdoms. And then those eventually splinter up too. West Francia and East Francia both absorb parts of Lotharingia. No, that would have been Hannibal, and he was much earlier, and Hannibal actually came from down here in Carthage. Attila was horseback. He was one of the earlier versions of the Central Asian dudes on horseback with bow and arrow who show up every now and again to melt people's faces off. You're good, dude. So Attila is a fascinating figure. With one of the most ironic deaths in history, this great conqueror who raped and murdered his way across the entirety of Western Europe chokes on a nosebleed at a party. If you can believe that. Yeah, no, just chokes on a nosebleed at the height of his power. Oh yeah, no, he got so drunk basically that he passed out, and it was one of those situations where he passed out on his back, and he had a nosebleed while he was sleeping, and it choked him because he was so drunk he couldn't wake up. He was completely passed out. Don't pity him too much though. He was kind of an asshole. He was kind of the blueprint for Genghis Khan and Temujin and later Central Asian dudes on horseback with bow and arrow. That's really the only way to describe them because they all came from roughly this area, and they all were horse nomads who typically fought on horseback with bow and arrow. Attila was more like, I'm gonna conquer it because I want to. The murder was definitely a plus of it for him, but he also liked the wealth that came from conquest, and especially the women. Actually, that was something Genghis Khan was very much known for. Genghis Khan didn't so much want the money as he wanted the women. Yeah, Naples has an interesting history in this period. It was under the reign of the Spaniards for quite a while. It gets its independence and is eventually part of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies before being. Naples is a lot of fun, and it's a great country to form Italy with. Especially now that it's easier to get out of the Union with Aragon. It used to be kind of a pain in the ass to get out of that union. But now it's considerably easier, and you actually get an event, and you don't have to worry about the Spaniards attacking you for it. That is awesome. I actually did some of that myself a few years ago. Um, Definitely try that. It is a lot of fun to do, and I actually found out some surprises. So I'm an American. You probably guessed that. Um, but I learned that my family, I'd always known I had a connection to the. I gotcha. But no, so I knew I had a connection to the French Canadians because my grandmother's maiden name is very French, and her family came from Quebec. And I learned that I can actually trace my ancestors in the New World all the way back to some of the first French settlers in the New World. Um, I am also part German, actually, descended from. That was another surprise I learned. I learned that my first ancestors in America proper, like the United States, were were actually German mercenaries hired by the British who defected because of an offer that stood back then for German mercenaries who. Oh, did they take it back? Damn it, they must have. Anyway, so they were German mercenaries hired by the English to fight in the Revolution. But at the time, the Americans had an offer on hand for any German mercenaries because they needed manpower. So some of my ancestors took that offer up, and if you served as an enlisted man, you got, I believe it was 25 acres at the end of the war, and if you served as an officer, you got 50. So way, way, way back when, some of my ancestors took the U.S. government up on that offer and settled somewhere in Pennsylvania after the war. And yeah, that's you'd have to ask the Irish about that. It probably has some root in Celtic, but I've never had much of an affinity for language, so I couldn't tell you. Oh, also the Swedes. Oh, damn it, I forgot. The Swedes must have declared their independence war. You couldn't have waited for better timing, Sweden? Really? Serves us better. I'm actually gonna save scum a little bit here. See if I can go back a year, maybe two. Yeah, no, especially like if I agree to wage an independence war on somebody's behalf, I would appreciate if they told me I'm at war. This just pops up in the bottom and it's like, oh, you're at war with Denmark now. Yeah, a bit more warning would be nice. But we're doing alright. I'm going to keep those guys there. Going to detach a siege here. And I'm going to blow their doors open. There we go. Right. It could be. So if you had a large enough kingdom that was under it, so it really existed because of things like personal unions and things like that, where you had a nation fall under the control of another that it didn't quite like, but due to monarchies, you have a situation where they're ruled by a foreign king. Well, a lot of people in the country that is being subjugated take issue with that for obvious reasons. So, if you get together a pretender to that throne and a large enough popular revolt, you can launch a revolt to get your independence, and oftentimes enemies of your former overlord would join your effort to fuck over their rivals. So it was something that happened, but it wasn't nearly as formal as it's portrayed in this game. Like, because the English wouldn't have, for example, in my case, with no king of Sweden, I wouldn't have had a authority in Sweden to go to ask to do that. Yeah, so at any given time, there were usually more than one claimant to a throne. Yeah, so think that, but in a personal union standpoint, where if they have a pretender together, then they have some legitimacy to their cause, and then they can usually get the support of some of the enemies of their overlords. Especially if it's a union of kingdoms like the Kalmar Union was, where neither Sweden nor Norway were ever formally integrated into the crown of Denmark. So they were technically independent kingdoms under the reign of the Danish king. And that's actually what Spain was for a lot of its colonial history. It wasn't Spain, it was the crowns of Castile and Aragon. And together they formed Spain, but they were separate kingdoms under the rule of the same monarch. Now that did change, and eventually they were united into the Kingdom of Spain. Um, Hold on, let me grant titles, ignore corruption, admin support, and support populists. Placate clergy too. So yeah, for a lot of its colonial history, Spain was actually a union of Castile and Aragon, not the Kingdom of Spain as you think of it. Eventually, they were formally joined, though, into one kingdom. Not always. It really depended on the kingdom. And in some, they couldn't inherit no matter what. So, for example, France, women couldn't inherit the throne no matter what. Yeah, in all likelihood, it's going to the firstborn son. And then if you have an older daughter and a younger son, it's going to the oldest son. That's how it goes. But in most kingdoms, how it was, if you had an, if you either only had a daughter or all of her brothers had died, she could inherit in places like England, which is what happened with Elizabeth I. She was the only heir, so she inherited. But if Elizabeth I had been a French princess, yeah, so the daughter of the king had more legitimacy in England than the king's brother, for example, or a cousin of hers, because she was a direct line from the previous king. But in France, women couldn't inherit regardless. That's why you didn't really see many queens of France. Also, yeah, so if another kingdom had a dynasty that was the same as yours, you might be able to finagle a claim out of it. That's kind of what the English did during the Hundred Years' War. Um, the King of England was not in the direct line of succession, but it could be argued under English law that he had a claim, even though it couldn't be argued under French law, because again, it was through his mother, and women couldn't inherit under French law. And French Salic law goes back a long way to the ancient Franks. Not particularly worried about that kind of a coalition. And you guys can go back here. You have, and that's one thing where it's not entirely accurate to history. Um, that's why multiple children were usually the go-to for monarchs. But like in this game, you can have a queen of France, but in history that didn't happen because women really couldn't inherit. And you have queen regents, for example, like a queen mother could rule in place of her son until he became of age, but women couldn't inherit titles under Salic law. But in England, that was no problem because the English, despite the fact that the Normans had a major influence, the English were operating from. They might have done, or it probably wasn't worth it to develop an entirely separate form of monarchy just for France, because the French monarchy wasn't that markedly different from the rest of Europe. It wasn't like England, where they had a whole parliamentary system. Um, in some other countries in continental Europe, women could definitely inherit. Um, but French Salic law probably didn't warrant the creation of a whole separate form of government just for the French, even though they're one of the countries you could probably do that with, because they were such a significant player in this period. And let's go to war with who are you? All right, Thomond and Scotland. So we'll deal with them last. Ormond has no allies, so let's go eat them up. Not much. Modern Italy, I know a little bit. So, like, Vittorio Emanuele and the unification. Um, but I can't say I know that much about sort of before that in Italian history. I know that Italy was mostly divided, and that for most of the time of the Holy Roman Empire, the King of Germany was also the King of Italy. So there wasn't a separate King of Italy. So the Holy Roman Emperor had a few titles. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, the Emperor of the Romans. He was also the King of Germany and the King of Italy. Um, in name, but he never the HRE the emperors were almost always German, with one exception who was a Czech, and they very rarely exerted heavy control south of the Alps. And Naples did have a king because Naples was south of the HRE. So this was kind of the dividing line between the HRE and southern Italy. Southern Italy was kind of its own thing for a long period of time. I know it seems blasphemous, but yeah, that goes back to Otto the First, who united the kingdoms, and he was kind of acting in Charlemagne's legacy, because Charlemagne certainly wasn't Italian either. Granted, neither French nor Italian really existed at that point, um, like as culture groups. They developed later in the interplay between the new Germanic settlers and the original Latinized inhabitants of those regions. And that's how we get modern French, Italian, Spanish. It was the blending of the new invaders with the Latin language. Um, but so the Kingdom of Naples in this game, You could argue it also goes like Naples as a kingdom. It kind of goes back to the kingdom of Sicily in the 12th century, which was founded by Normans. Um, so Germany is an interesting country in terms of how it's named, right? So most countries in Western Europe refer to it as Germany because that was the Roman name for the area. So the Romans called this region Germania, which was the land of the Germani or the Germans, and that's where a lot of countries get the name from. But not every country has the same name for Germany. For example, the French use Allemagne, which is the tribe that lived kind of right here. So they were the Alemanni. And so the French associated this region with them, not the broader Germani, especially because the French came from the Franks, who were a different Germanic group from the Low Countries. Yeah, a lot of the Latin languages use Alemannia, some root of Alemannia, um, because it comes from the Alemanni tribe, because that was the tribe that these people were closest to. Um, but for example, the Polish use Niemcy, which is a completely different root. Um, and the Germans call themselves Deutsche or Deutschland. Um, but a lot of different places have a lot of different names for Germany because Germany as a politically unified thing is incredibly recent. For most of its history, it was very internally divided. So a lot of people developed names for the people they were closest to, not necessarily the people as a whole. But the thing is, if you go back far enough, most of the kingdoms of Western Europe are related to the Germanic invaders in the 4th and 5th centuries. So the French came from the Franks, the Kingdom of Italy was the Ostrogoths and the Lombards. The Germans were, well, the Germans, although the Kingdom of Germany does it kind of arises out of East Francia, because there wasn't that much difference between the Franks and the West Franks and the East Franks until the West Franks kind of started to adopt Latin and become more of what we would associate with the French, whereas the East Franks retained the Germanic language and more Germanic cultural aspects, and that's kind of where the divide comes. And then you have the Visigoths in Spain, and also the Suebi, who were a tribe who settled in modern-day Galicia and northern Portugal. But they're both Germanic tribes who conquered Iberia and settled there, although they have a very different history because of the influence of the Moors and the Muslims, and that's its whole other thing. But modern Spain does kind of go all the way back to the Visigoths. They were the some of the earlier in Christian, like the first like unified Iberia, aside from being unified under the Romans, happened under the Visigoths. And I find it interesting that the Ostrogoths are pretty darn famous, mostly because of Odoacer, but they're kind of a flash in the pan. They fade out pretty quickly, largely because the Byzantines conquering Italy. And they get replaced by the Lombards, who are probably a bit more famous, honestly, than the Ostrogoths. It's the Visigoths who hang on the longest as the Gothic peoples. Although you could also argue that Aragon is also derived. The Visigoths conquered all of Iberia. What happens is because part of the reason you see this splintering of cultures in Spain is due to the Muslim conquest. It shatters the kingdom of the Visigoths, and you have smaller political bodies that fall into different groups. So, like, you have the kingdom of Asturias in the north here, and that resists the Muslims in its own right. And then you have the Duchy of Barcelona, which kind of falls into the Frankish sphere and actually was part of Charlemagne's empire for a while. Um, and then you have the Basques, who are kind of a wild card in all of this, and didn't like either the Asturians or the future Aragonese. So over time, the Asturias winds up conquering most of northern Iberia, and it splinters upon the death of I'm blanking on the king's name, but when one of the Iberian kings, the kings of Asturias, dies, it splinters into Galicia, Leon, and Castile, and then Navarre is over here as well, kind of as a Basque kingdom. And then you have um, no, these were firmly under the control of Aragon at this point. Although these remained, the Baleares were their own taifa under a Muslim ruler for a while. Um, oh yeah, no worries. But yeah, so the Muslims kind of change everything for the Spaniards. That's why they're very different from the rest of the other Germanic-derived kingdoms of Western Europe. They have that Arabian and North African influence culturally, and you can see it in their language. The Spanish language borrows far more from Arabic than it does from old Germanic peoples. There's only a few words hanging around that are related to the Visigoths. Yeah, so Spain as a united country doesn't really show up until the end of the 15th century, with the Iberian Union and the wedding of Ferdinand and Isabel. Before that point, yeah, before that point, Spain was multiple divided kingdoms that fought with themselves about as much as they fought with the Muslims. Um, yeah, and you have Aragon and Barcelona existed as well at the same time. Barcelona wasn't always under the control of Aragon, but eventually, as usually happens. Thank you. Yeah, I studied history in college, but before that, I had just a lifelong love of the subject, and also we this war. Oh, they didn't tell me again, but apparently the Swedes have gone to war. But yeah, I watched the History Channel when it was still good, before it became about like Nazi aliens or whatever goofy shit they're talking about on there now. There was a time when the History Channel was good, and it was about the time that I was a kid and I grew up watching it. Um, Egypt was actually my first like historical love. I was fascinated with Egypt when I was a kid, and I was lucky enough to go to a college that had a fantastic Egyptologist, and I took several of her classes. Um, but yeah, Egypt, and then later the Romans became an obsession, and for the past several years, it's been the medieval era, which is kind of the polar opposite. Oh Lord, that is the worst when you're waiting for RNGesus to get on your side. Ugh, that's the worst. Um, but yes, so actually my love of history partially dates back to my parents kind of stoked it by giving me a book on it, and this was a mistake, sending these guys unguarded. I should have expected that. All right, there we go. We got it now. So my parents gave me a book on a. Huh. I did not know that, but thank you. That is good to know. But yeah, my parents stoked my interest in history by responding to my obsession with Egypt by getting me a big book, like a big kids book on Egyptology, and it was that was it. I was in love with history. And then another of my favorite teachers really solidified that early love of the subject. In middle school, I was taught by Mr. Ippolito, who his parents were raised during Mussolini's Italy, and he loved history. And he was an interesting guy. He'd been all around the world. He was a businessman who made so much money early in his career. He could basically retire in his 40s and teach for fun. And he really encouraged my love of history and is a big part of why I went down that path academically. And I started the podcast itself because I got to a point in my life where I wasn't particularly satisfied that I wasn't. Thank you. Yeah, no, I got to a point where I wasn't particularly satisfied with everything I was doing because I enjoy my job. And I enjoyed my job when I started the podcast. I've changed jobs between, but I wanted to fix what I see as a very much a lack of historical literacy, especially in the United States. But honestly, globally, I find a lot of people aren't as historically literate as they probably should be. The world's way cooler when you know the history behind it. I'll say that much. Like a few years back, as my graduation gift to myself, I saved up money for years, so I took a trip to England, Ireland, and Italy, and I got to see a good bit of southern England, a good chunk of central and western Ireland, and then I spent the entire Italy section in Rome. And it was very cool because I knew a lot of the significance behind the old buildings I was seeing. Like, if you, like, I mean, you said you're Italian. I don't know how much time you spent in Rome, but if you go to Termini Station, there is a small segment of wall just outside of the train station. That wall actually dates back to the original walls of the city of during the Republic. Like that wall is over 2,000 years old because dates back to the Roman Republic. And yeah, I agree with you. History is not appreciated as much as it should be. And I mean, if you look at American schools, that's one of the programs that's getting cut. So it's not getting better unless regular people try to educate about history as much as we can. Like, I mean, I did consider becoming a teacher, but I didn't like the idea of being beholden to a curriculum I didn't have control over. Oh, I gotcha, I gotcha. Actually, my sister's boyfriend is also Italian diaspora. He's been able to trace his family back to San Marino. Definitely go if you get the chance. Rome is the only place I've been in Italy, but it is beyond beautiful. And I mean, if you love Roman history, so much of it is still standing, and it's impressive. All right, we are winning this war for the Swedes. Like it was cool going to Ireland because I also have a fair amount of Irish ancestry. Hard to not have that if you're from the United States. But I got to see the family castle. I'm descended from the Lynches, who were in a family of Irish nobility from Western Ireland, and they ruled out of Galway for a long period of time. And they had a castle, Lidge Castle, which is now a bank. We couldn't go in; it was closed. We got there on a weekend. Um, it was a bummer that the family castle was a bank, but it's still cool to know that there was one. I mean, Naples is on my list of places I would like to visit as well. But yeah, so out here in Connacht, the city of Galway, that's where my Irish family came from. And I got to see the castle, which was nice. And then my girlfriend is of mixed Scottish Irish origin, and she wants to go see the castle that her family's associated with there. So a trip to Scotland is in my future, probably. And I've got maybe sooner than I was hoping too, because I've got a buddy who is doing. I have a lot of historian friends, and one of them is an expert on the War of the Roses and English history. And he is going to do a year abroad studying at St. Andrews University in Scotland. So I'm going to try to get out there and visit him. But no, the world is so much cooler if you know how you got where you are, and if you know the historical significance of things you can still go see today. Because a lot of it is still there. And if we don't take care of it, it'll be lost, but it doesn't get taken care of if it's not appreciated. And then if you're up for traveling, I can't recommend Dublin enough. It is a hell of a fun city. The people are super friendly, and some of the best beer you will get outside of Germany and Czechia. I think if you go to Scotland, you gotta try the haggis. I went to Amsterdam back in 2012, and someone recommended I try the pickled herring, and I was like, well, that sounds a little odd, but I'll give it a go, and it was delicious. That was another trip I went on longer before that, but that was a cool trip because it was battlefields of World War II. So we got to see Omaha Beach, we got to see Amsterdam, the Ardennes Forest, um, bits of Germany as well. Hell of a fun trip. Uh, but we had a French tour guide, and we just lost at sea, which should not have happened because we're England. But we had a French tour guide who recommended we try the pickled herring in Amsterdam, and I was a little like, pickled herring? Okay. And I tried it and I loved it. It was wonderful, and I wish I could have it again, but you can't find it in the States. Haggis, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it's a bunch of ingredients cooked inside the stomach of a sheep. But again, I could be wrong there, so let me know if I messed that one up. All right, we might have just secured Swedish independence from the Danes. So I'm going to send the Royal Army back so they can recover. And yeah, if you want to do a DNA test, they are fun. And like I found out that from a genetic standpoint, um, there's a bit more there than I thought there was. So I learned I have some English ancestry, at least from a genetic standpoint. I guess I wonder where you go to get it then, because I mean, Edinburgh is like the heart of Scottish culture. So my friend will probably learn when he goes. So I will learn from him where to get haggis, because he's told me that St Andrews is a small town north of Edinburgh. So maybe in the smaller towns it'll be easier to come by. My impression is that Edinburgh is fairly large and metropolitan, so it might be hard to find the local food. But I think if you go to Scotland, you almost have to try haggis, and you almost have to try a Scotch egg, which actually sounds a lot more appetizing than haggis, but I'm going to try both of them when I go. Also nice, so I will have to check that out in whenever I end up in Scotland. And then the fun part about my girlfriend and I's ancestry is we actually both come from the weird kind of Canadians. So we have she comes from the Scots Canadians, I come from the French Canadians. So we're probably going to do a trip along the Gulf of St. Lawrence at some point. It'll get a lot easier to plan all this shit when COVID is out of the way. Yeah, there we go. Just do that. Castilian Civil War is over. What's going on down here? It annoys my OCD that Portugal grabbed Malaga. I am nowhere near Montreal. I'm from Maryland, Baltimore, born and bred. Which I mean, Baltimore is kind of a cool city, but there's a lot of the world I'd like to see, and too much of it that I haven't. Closest I've ever been to Montreal is we went to go visit when I was very little. Went to go visit my French Canadian family that live in Vermont. Um, but we didn't go further north because none of us had passports at the time. See, and then France, I absolutely adored when I went. Oh, nice. I actually had a buddy who studied meteorology there. Uh, he's from right around DC, but no, I'm a Baltimore guy. I've always wondered if it kind of showed my accent a little bit, because I sometimes catch myself slipping with the East Baltimore. I'll because my grandfather had a bit of it, so sometimes it'll slip out with me. And it is beyond disappointing. All right, so Henry Lancaster is about to take the throne. It has been a very long time, and we're in the process of rebuilding our fleet, which is basically destroyed. I gotcha. I have been to. I went to Cleveland and got to see the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is really cool. But I'm glad to hear that the accent isn't coming through. The Baltimore accent is it's not it's not the best. It's not one of those accents people think is sexy. And we got War of the Roses going on again, which sucks, but what can you do? And we want exploration. But yeah, I am pretty firmly East Coast. I haven't actually been off the East Coast much. Um, I do have a fair amount of experience with New England. My sister went to school up there, so I got to see a fair amount of like Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. I love Boston. I've been a few times. But yeah, I think I know what you're getting at there with yeah, no, definitely go. Boston is a great city. Um so much cool old colonial stuff there. Like I thought we had some cool colonial stuff in Maryland, but Boston has us beat. That said, if you want some cool Civil War stuff, come to Maryland. Um, Antietam is really cool, and if you come around Christmas time, they have this big candlelit vigil where they light a candle for every single soldier who died in the battle. It is also supposed to be extremely haunted if you're into that sort of thing. Yeah, no, there were tens of thousands, but no, it is really cool to see. But hmm, I didn't see that. Huh. I haven't played the Red Flood mod. Is that the one where everybody's communists? And as for the monuments, I haven't actually read about that, but that could be a lot of fun. I'd have to see what each of them conferred, but that could be a fun dimension to certain provinces. Because like some buildings were, I mean, iconic even then. I gotcha. So that could be a lot of fun. Kind of makes me think of Civ Wonders. I am excited for Leviathan. Um, it's been a long time since Southeast Asia got any attention, if it ever has gotten attention. So I'm kind of excited to see what they do with it. Um, there was a lot of interesting stuff going on out there in that period that doesn't isn't really known all that well. Like you have the Kingdom of the Khmer, you have the building of Angkor Wat. Cool stuff that not enough people know about. I'm excited to see what new mechanics they implement as well. I should probably start upgrading these centers of trade. I honestly think if they were going to do an Asia patch, they should have prioritized China because Ming is kind of a joke. When in reality, it was like the world power in this period, at least in the early part of this period. Okay, so Scotland has two allies that I can get at them with in Ireland. Yeah, Ming is a joke. Granted, a lot of this game takes place during the later Ming, which is when they were on the decline, but they were once Ming were they were one of China's greatest dynasties. No bones about it. Local investors do the thing. So really, they should be better than they are, but also they were on decline. And actually, they used to be a lot worse. I've noticed, I don't know, this could just be me, but it seems like the Ottomans have been kind of pathetic compared to what they used to be. Yeah, so that's an example of one crazy emperor ruining everything. Because you got the rise of this one rather xenophobic emperor who didn't want anything to do with the outside world. Yeah, they definitely did. So I'm glad I'm not alone in realizing that. But I rarely see them conquer Egypt these days. That wouldn't be a bad idea. The only problem is they would probably steamroll the entire rest of Europe, or the entire rest of Asia, a lot more than they did historically. So I get why they don't, like for balance reasons, but But realistically, the Ming should be a lot stronger than they are. Pretender escapes, damn. Definitely. Although Spain's peak of power is in about the 16th century, after they've conquered a lot of the New World. So, but until that point, Ming was still like the top of the world. I mean, the Ottomans are a great like final boss for this game. Or at least they used to be a better final boss, but because it used to be you had to wait until like the 16th, or no, it would have been about the 17th century before you can actually fight them. Because you need to wait until they get like the decline of the Janissaries event until they're actually fightable by anybody who isn't also the Ottomans or who doesn't have like Russia manpower. Yeah, the Medieval 2 Total War was a lot of fun. That's a classic. I grew up playing a lot of Age of Empires. That was one of my dad's favorites, and Civilization. All right, we got order now. That was fast. Way faster than the actual historical War of the Roses. So I actually did a series on the Crusades that you might be interested to check out. Um, yeah, once you get the hang of it, and you, as long as you're not playing near them, they don't have the fear factor they used to. Sure, go do that, Castile. But yeah, I did do a series on the Crusades that you would probably want to check out because that's one of those historical periods that I don't think is understood in the slightest by a lot of people. Most people have no idea what actually went down during the Crusades. But I'm posting episode 1 here, so check it out if you like. So that depends on who you ask. So you can check out that episode, that series. It was an 8 episode run that I did that covered the Crusades from the rise of Islam to 1453. So, were the Crusades a success? In Spain, yes, because you can honestly look at the Reconquista as a sort of an additional part of the crusading movement, and that was very successful. The Crusades in the East were another story. Thanks, I take pride in my titles. But the Crusades in the East were a very different situation. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem lasted 200 years, which is not bad for a kingdom that is surrounded by enemies on all sides, all of whom hate it and want it gone. Um, but it also is the creation of this fascinating hybridized culture where you get this mixing of Europe and the Middle East. Um, yeah, there were Baltic Crusades too. That's another. I didn't really cover those in the series because they seemed a bit too far removed from what I was really focusing on. But yeah, the Crusades in the Baltics were brutal. And actually, I did a blog series on that. Let me see if I can find that for you. And I did this alongside the audio episodes I was doing on the Crusades. But that blog series covers the Baltic Crusades, which is how this region got Christianized and why the Teutonic Order is where it is. These were some of the last pagans in Europe, in the Baltic countries. Um, and as the Crusades in the Middle East kind of faltered as Jerusalem fell to the Muslims, the Crusaders decided it would be far easier to attack pagans closer to home. So a lot of Crusaders, particularly from Germany, went out into the Baltics to conquer and Christianize the area. And the Teutonic and Livonian orders were two of the most prominent ones who did that. But the Swedes and the Danes also got in on that action. But returning to the Middle Eastern Crusades, which you have there, they did call themselves the Germans. Teutonic Order is a bit of a more modern thing. I used that because that's the name that at least a lot of people I talk to know them as, and that's kind of the more popular name. Um, so I will probably put a note in there about that, but I figured I'd refer to them as the more well-known name because I think it's better that people know just what they were, um, even if they get the name slightly ahistorical. It's like I don't memorizing dates, memorizing individual figures is not as important, I think, as having a general knowledge of what happened and why it was happening. So the Middle Eastern Crusades have to be understood in the context of a Christendom that had been under constant attack from the Muslims since roughly the 7th century AD. There was no rest. There was constant warfare, largely with the Muslims as the aggressors, for a long period of time. So honestly, I think the Crusades should be looked at far more as a response to that than there are a lot of people who like to look at the Crusades as some kind of proto-colonial effort, and that's a load of horseshit. Because not only did the idea of colonialism not exist back then, the idea of capitalism still didn't exist, so there was no economic exploitation of the natives. In fact, most of the crusading lords that went over single took local brides. And the leading dynasty of Jerusalem was mixed. They were mixed Frankish Armenian or Frankish Arab. And you even have a lot of like local Middle Eastern ethnic groups that get on board with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So you have a whole group of people called Turco-Poles who were Turkish converts to Christianity who fought on behalf of the Crusaders. So that's another thing you got to understand is before the rise of Islam, all of North Africa was Christian. And there were still a lot of Christians that lived there under Islamic rule, especially in Egypt, where you have the Coptic Church is still powerful, like is still a major force even today. Although the modern repression of the Copts is a completely different issue. Um, so the justification, at least for the Western Crusaders, was the reclamation of the Holy Land. Well, originally it was to help Byzantium, but eventually it became reclaim the Holy Land. Uh, I don't know why it. Yeah, so they were trying to take back lands. So all of this was Christian. I mean, you have some early church fathers from North Africa. So like Augustine of Hippo, the saint, is from modern day Tunisia. Um, and Egypt was a serious hotbed of early Christianity. In fact, the Egyptians and the Greeks were two of the strongest early takers for the religion, and some of the oldest churches in the world can be found in Egypt and Anatolia because of the Greeks and the Egyptians. Actually, one of the world's oldest monasteries is on the Sinai Peninsula because monasticism as a practice started um, in Egypt. They were people who went out into the desert to connect with what they believe Jesus experienced during his 40 days of fasting before the Passion. Um, so all of that land was Christian before the rise of the Muslims, and they forcibly converted the vast majority of it, but there was still a significant Christian minority living in this region, and especially in the Holy Land, where you have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and a lot of Syriac and Palestinian Christians living there that were languishing under the Muslims. So the Crusaders go and they conquer it and they establish a kingdom that lasts for 200 years, which is again pretty good considering it was surrounded by enemies on all sides, and all of those enemies very much hated it. Yeah, so the Stylites were a group of monks that just sat atop pillars in the desert. The most famous one of them was Saint Simon the Stylite, who actually once berated a Roman emperor in front of a crowd in Jerusalem, and turned the crowd against him because they all viewed him as this incredibly holy man who like achieved enlightenment out in the desert. Um, but no, the Egypt and Greece slash Anatolia were the early hotbeds of Christianity, and the Christians were losing them because the Byzantines were really the last bulwark between Europe and Islam in the Middle East, the Islamic culture group really. And when the Seljuk Turks conquered pretty much all of Anatolia, they were now a significantly larger threat for some of the kingdoms of Eastern Europe. They now felt a lot closer than they had done to the kings of like Hungary and Poland and even the Kaiser of the HRE. That said, the early Crusades, part of the reason why they were successful is, yeah, they were the only real high culture, but you have developing high cultures in Western Europe in this period, at least as far as Christianity is concerned. So, like, you have Western European monasticism, you have Gothic cathedrals, you have the Gregorian plain chant, and things like that developing. But a lot of that did come from Byzantine influence as well. But with the rapid decline of Byzantium, you see a lot of kings in particularly the Balkans and Eastern Europe getting a little bit nervous about the Turks. Um, and that nervousness was pretty well founded if you consider what happened afterwards. Um, the problem is the Crusades go off the rails, and you have by the Fourth Crusade kind of marks the decline of the movement. But by the time of the Fourth Crusade, Jerusalem was long gone. So you have the First Crusade that establishes the Kingdom of Jerusalem right at the turn of the 11th century. And then for most of the 12th century, you have this hybrid culture that emerges in the Middle East. And it is fascinating because you have, yes, he did. So Pope Urban II launched the first one, and successive popes launched later crusades. Um, but after the Fourth Crusade, the movement really lost steam because the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade did sack the single greatest city in Christendom when they attacked Constantinople. So that caused a lot of people to kind of lose faith in crusading as an idea. And the movement began to decline, and a lot of the Crusades then refocused on Western Europe, fighting heretics and heathens far closer to home. And the only real crusading movement that was largely successful was the Reconquista. And yes, the Byzantines did. Yeah, for the early part of its history, the Ottomans were largely a Christian empire ruled by Muslims. So yeah, the Crusades went completely off the rails by the Fourth Crusade. And yeah, the Byzantines weren't blameless in all of this. But the Fourth Crusaders were completely out of line in what they did. So the city had been surrendered to the Fourth Crusaders, and they were about to establish a Latin kingdom there. The thing was, because there wasn't a clear leader of that crusade, none of them really had a full claim to it, and the king would have been elected. So all of the leaders of the Fourth Crusade were like, fuck it, we're getting what we can get. And the looting and sack they did to Constantinople, the only other sack of the city that's comparable was what the Muslims did in the 15th century, and that was worse. But still, one of the worst sacks in Constantinople's history was delivered by its fellow Christians because none of them stood to be the new emperor. And the Fourth Crusade is also complex because it got excommunicated twice. The first time when it attacked a Christian city in Croatia, and the Pope said, no, you can't do that. Fuck all y'all, you're excommunicated. And then they begged forgiveness and said, we'll get this crusade back on track. And they didn't. And then they attacked Constantinople, and then they all got excommunicated a second time. And the Pope had washed his hands of it. Um, right, so that was actually during the First Crusade. Basically, yeah. So during the First Crusade, the Byzantines didn't really do anything to garner the trust of the Latins, because they kind of got into what was that city? What was that city? I'm gonna bribe an advisor. I am. It's. This is gonna bother me. What was the name of that city? It was modern day Izmit. I'm blanking on what the Byzantines called it. Um, they kind of went around the Christians to take it because they didn't, or the Latin Christians, because they didn't trust that the Latins would give it back to them once it had been taken. And then during the siege of Antioch, the Byzantines eroded that trust even further, um, because Antioch was kind of a disaster of a siege, at least for the first part of it. Um, it was a mess, and a lot of crusaders didn't think they'd live through it. So a fair number of them started fleeing back home. One of them encountered Emperor Alexios Komnenos while he was marching with support for the crusaders to besiege Antioch. When he talked to this fleeing crusader, yes, they were the horses at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice were taken from Constantinople because the Venetians and that blind asshole Enrico Dandolo were the main reason that Constantinople was attacked. Where was I? Oh yeah, but at Antioch. So a lot of crusaders thought the siege was a bust. So they went home, and one of them encountered the right. So the Byzantines also cooperated with the Turks, which didn't really help perceptions from the Latins. But when the Byzantine emperor heard that the siege was going bad, he packed up and went home, and that didn't really get him any favors with the Crusaders. But the relationship the Crusaders had with the Muslims was also pretty complex. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem was more often than not allied with the Arabs against the Turks because the Turks and Arabs did not like each other one bit. The Arabs thought the Turks were uncultured barbarians, and the Turks thought the Arabs were soft and effeminate. So they didn't much care for each other. So more often, and the Arabs got along better with the Crusaders than the Turks did. So more often than not, the Crusaders would help the Arabs fight the Turks because they kind of shook up the power of the region where you have an Arab-led Egypt and a Turkish-led Syria and Mesopotamia. So the Egyptians and the Arabs by proxy largely didn't mind the Crusaders because they viewed them as a way to upset the Turkish dominance in the region. Because the Kingdom of Jerusalem was very good at fighting. That is one thing they did remarkably well. Um, for such a small kingdom with relatively limited manpower, they really held their own, and more often than not, they were outnumbered. The big difference came in how they did it. Um, European cavalry played the largest part, not the actual horses, the way they were used. Um, Heavily armored cavalrymen were not something the Arabs or Turks really used a lot. They used lighter cavalry to support large infantry armies. The European knight, on the other hand, was a heavily armored cavalryman that the Muslims had a very hard time dealing with because they had no real counter to it. The only saving grace for the Muslims was that there weren't many knights relative to the main bodies of Christian armies. There we go. Got our trade port going. Um, so what you see happening is sometimes very small numbers of knights are able to fight off much larger Muslim armies and get the better of them, which really shouldn't have happened considering the sheer numerical advantage the Muslims had. But it did happen because again, the Europeans had a weapon the Muslims had no real counter to. And really, the winged hussars are kind of an evolution of that idea. They were heavily armored cavalrymen that delivered devastating charges after the infantry had softened up the target. And it's a big difference in how they fought, too. And part of it's environmental. So you're not really going to have dudes covered in... You're not really... Heavy armor is not particularly practical in the desert. You die of heat stroke. Same thing with heavy armor on your horses. That's why Arabian horses tend to have thinner, lighter builds. They were bred for hot environments. And actually, a lot of Crusaders adopted these smaller, lighter horses because they did better in the warm environment they were in. A lot of the European war horses were heavy and they didn't like the heat. Um, so they were able to make the heavy armor work. But the reason the Muslims never really developed that is heavy armor is not all that practical in the desert. Judaism was a very small minority in the Holy Land at this time. This is well after the point where the Jews became a major diaspora across pretty much the whole of the Mediterranean basin. Yes, there were Jews in Jerusalem. They were more often than not caught between the Christians and the Muslims during their fighting. Yeah, so the Europeans develop very heavy cavalry because the environment allows for it. The Muslim cavalry was always much lighter because it's far warmer, and strapping that much armor on a horse is going to cause the poor thing to die of heat stroke. Um, Really depends on how you perceive it. So the Jews weren't getting out on top no matter who was in charge of the Holy Land because neither the Christians nor the Muslims particularly liked them a whole lot. They were generally Mamluk cavalry is very good, and they were kind of the exception to the rule. But the vast majority of Muslim cavalry throughout its history was fairly lightly armored and relied on speed and hit and run tactics as opposed to devastating charges. Um, so the Jews were subjugated by both of them. In my estimation, they were treated better under the Christians than they were under the Muslims. Neither the Christians nor the Muslims actively suppressed the religion, at least any more than was normal for the time. The Jews kind of got along as they did most other places. The big difference is the the laws applied evenly regardless of religion in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, whereas the law applied unequally to Muslims and non-Muslims under Islamic rule. And Christians and Jews had to pay a very hefty tax called the jizya in under Islamic rule that Jews didn't have to pay under Christian rule. So really depends. You could argue that the Muslims were a bit more religiously tolerant, of Judaism, but they also weren't as financially suppressed under Christianity. And yeah, there was major Jewish culture going on in Al-Andalus. Um, and actually, that was very much to the Muslims' benefit because the Muslim lords of Al-Andalus very much enjoyed playing the Jews and Christians off one another. Because if they were focused on fighting each other, they weren't going to revolt against the Muslims. And that worked for a while, at least for the Christians and Jews living under Muslim rule. It didn't go so well for the ones. It didn't really work in the kingdoms that weren't under Muslim rule. So like Asturias. That is true, and there are a lot of kingdoms and nations in the world today that have a religious preference and actively enforce it. So Indonesia is not unique for that. It's not good no matter where it's done, but it is still done. So if you're a lot of history documentaries have used it to illustrate battles, because a lot of the troop models are relatively accurate for the day. Um, oh, sorry, I thought you meant medieval too. I honestly don't know about that. If you're the problem with using Crusader Kings 2 as a history aid is that it goes off the rails almost as soon as you press the start button, and it kind of detaches from history rapidly. Though if you're trying to illustrate feudalism to somebody who has no basis in it, then yes, Crusader Kings 2 is useful because feudalism is very confusing to people who grew up in the modern era. A lot of people, well, most people who haven't studied it are have trouble wrapping their heads around feudalism because it is so completely alien as a system of government to what you have now in sort of modern liberal democracies. It is about as far from those as you can get. And I think a lot of people have trouble processing it. But Crusader Kings does a decent job illustrating how that system actually worked. And it did work for quite a long time, otherwise they wouldn't have been doing it. Like, there's nothing inherently morally wrong about feudalism. It was actually relatively advanced for its time, and more or less a sort of progression of what was already happening at the end of the Roman Empire. In my estimation, people are far too down on the medieval era, and they like to look down on medieval Europe. Kind of. It's a bit more complicated than that. So think of a kingdom this way, and you need to. It isn't, but if you're looking at it in its historical context, feudalism is as good as any other system. So the way feudalism worked, and you have to kind of have a decent grounding in Catholicism to really understand it. So the earthly court was supposed to imitate the heavenly court. So at the top of it, you have the king, who is the father of the country, and he is in the role of God. He is divinely appointed by God to rule. So let's take England, for example. The King of England is divinely appointed by God to rule England. That's how it was looked at as. So he had a duty to be a just ruler. They didn't always do that. No system is. Most systems are not perfect. But that was kind of how it was supposed to work. Yes, the Black Death. Well, the Black Death was the main factor for the end of feudalism pretty much everywhere. And I'll get to that. So, yeah, the king was sort of at the top of the hierarchy. And look at it this way, all of England was the personal property of the King of England. That's kind of how it was. Now, in principle, how feudalism worked is he would because no one person can rule all of that land effectively. So what the king would do is hand out parcels of land to vassals directly under him. And these were your counts and your dukes. Dukes typically ranked higher than counts, but you did sometimes have very powerful counts that just used that as their title. So typically it went king and then dukes and then counts and then barons. Um, so the dukes ruled larger territories under the king, and then they typically would assign local rulers in the form of barons and counts to rule even further subrealms. And largely the system was based on peasants would work the land in exchange for protection from the nobles. Um, so then you have knights factoring in, and many nobles were knights, but not all knights were landed nobility. Sometimes a knight was just a warrior who was in the service of landed nobility, but he didn't hold any land of his own, though he could get some as a reward for service. But not all knights were landed nobility, and the unlanded knights were not particularly prestigious. They were allowed to carry weapons, they did better than most people, but they also weren't riding high like the true nobles of the day and age. Um, and more often than not, if a knight proved himself through years of loyal service and effective service, he would get a fief of land for his own. So, more often than not, something small like a barony. Um, and then below them, you have sort of wealthy non-nobles who would have been like your merchant class or your peasants. It didn't always have to be the king. The king was the most prestigious person to be knighted by, but theoretically any knight could knight another person. So if a knight encountered a peasant who particularly impressed him with bravery, then that knight might bestow upon him a knighthood. So as long as you could be knighted into the knighthood by any other knight, and I feel like I've said the word knight way too many times. Um, but it didn't have to be the king. But yeah, so the way the Black Death brought about the end of feudalism in most of Western Europe was, well, it killed a fuckload of people. And that'll shake up any system, really. But the reason it changed, yeah, it was very different in reality, and that is another way of looking at it. But the nobility is the first several ranks of that pyramid I was talking about. So the king, the dukes, the counts, the barons, and the knights are all nobles. So it wasn't. This is the thing that a lot of history classes make the mistake of doing. There was no hard point where it went from being feudal to not feudal. The progression from feudalism to modern capitalist economies occurs very incrementally over time. The Black Death accelerates it in one very important way. It kills a lot of people. So that, in a pure supply and demand, forces the price of labor up. So if you're a tradesman or a laborer not of the nobility, your services are now much more valuable to the nobles who need them. So they have to pay a premium to get them. And those former peasants become the beginnings of a middle class. And that middle class has the money to spend on high culture because they want to imitate the nobility and the wealthy. And they do. And this is kind of how you start moving out of feudalism and into more modern economies. Russia was still very feudal, but that was. And the thing is, Russia, you can't really look at Russia as purely European. Russia is where Europe and Asia meet. It's neither European nor is it Asian, but at the same time, it's both. So Russia was backwards compared to Western Europe, but very forwards compared to the rest of Asia. And culturally, they had a few more elements borrowed from Asia than did the rest of Western Europe. And really, until Peter the Great, you could argue that Russia was almost more Eastern than it was Western. Peter the Great forced Russia to become more Western, um, although that didn't really do much for bringing about the end of feudalism in Russia. That said, before the Communist Revolution and before World War I, Russia was going through an economic boom as the economy was liberalized. It just didn't happen fast enough to avert disaster. Um, but yeah, typically pandemics that kill a lot of people will shake up any system, and that is exactly what the Black Death did to feudalism. Because there was no way to maintain it when the price of labor got as high as it did. Feudalism was easy when peasant labor was dirt cheap, because there were so many of them. It did linger in an informal sense, and I'm not saying that things in Russia were better than they were anywhere else. What I'm saying is that as the also, yeah. So the Black Death was the 1340s, and it wasn't 1 year. It lasted for about a decade. I want to say 1341 for its arrival in Europe to 1348 for the last major year of the plague. But yeah, so serfdom in Russia wasn't formally abolished until the 1800s, and it did remain in an informal sense, but there were some important economic liberalization efforts made in the late 19th century that get glossed over because it was kind of a boring period in history, at least for Russia. And they the economy did improve greatly and it was growing very, very fast, just not fast enough for enough people to avert the communist revolution, although World War I did play a major part in bringing that about. um, I've said this. COVID is nothing compared to what the Black Death was. That said, modern people are far softer than medieval people. Medieval people were tough as nails compared to modern people. Yeah, you can have a monarchy without feudalism. Monarchies existed before the rise of feudalism, and they still exist centuries after the fact. Um, so, like, there were plenty of European monarchies in the late 19th century, like around World War One, but they weren't feudal. They were effectively modern economies that just happened to be led by a king as opposed to a president or a senate or something along those lines. But no, I have mentioned this before in an episode I did on something. But I said that oh no, it was actually near the end of the Crusade series. I mentioned this because that I did that episode right as COVID was kind of like going and ending its first phase. Yeah, so EU4 monarchies are a bit closer to modern monarchies. They're absolute monarchies, at least in a sense. So the absolute monarchy is sort of a Louis the XIV, I am the state kind of deal, where the king became the heart and soul of the nation. Basically, the king was the most important person in it, and he held, yeah, basically it was that kind of an idea. Also, this is not going to be cheap, but I can't lose this war. So European Universalis 4 takes place during the rise of um, absolute monarchies throughout Europe. And France was kind of the poster boy for this, and the excesses of the monarchy were a lot of what led to the French Revolution. But the Russians really were even better at the whole absolute monarchy deal. Are you kidding me with? Okay, there we go. That was I was about to be really mad. So the Russians were very good at the whole absolute monarchy deal, and the Tsar was even more totalitarian than the King of France ever was. And you'll find that like absolute monarchy doesn't really take root in some countries where there were already factors prohibiting it. So the English monarchy never gets particularly absolute because the English had a long cultural history of freedom, really. And I don't mean freedom in like the modern sense. I'm referring to freedom in a very different sense. And that really can be traced back to the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons were almost libertarian for their period. In Anglo-Saxon England, there weren't any serfs, really. Most of the Anglo-Saxon population were freedmen who owned their own land and worked it accordingly. And that was what really set Anglo-Saxon England apart from the other kingdoms of Europe. Because the people in Anglo-Saxon England were far freer than they were anywhere else. And they worked their own land, which was a rarity elsewhere, especially in places like France, where feudalism starts pretty early, and peasants are the vast majority of the population. The other thing is the Anglo-Saxons had this almost cultural, and I'm using the term libertarian because it's really the closest approximation to what I'm trying to illustrate for you. Anglo-Saxon kings were pretty hands-off, all things considered, and more often than not just let their vassals rule their own realms. And I mean, it was also an elective monarchy. The king was elected by the Wittengemot, which was an assembly of noblemen. So it was one of the earlier elective monarchies in Europe. Awesome, thanks. Thanks for turning out for the stream. I do this one every Sunday, and I do either a multiplayer or a Crusader Kings 3 stream every Friday. So thanks for turning out. Thanks for subscribing. And I'm actually only going to be on for about another 20 or so minutes because I got work tomorrow. But yeah, so and I used libertarian again because it's about as close to what I'm trying to get across as you can get in the medieval era. But obviously modern political libertarianism is a very different thing from what the Anglo-Saxons were getting up to. Also, yes, that was part of that sort of Anglo-Saxon tradition of freedom, and it subjugated even the king to the law, which was fucking revolutionary at the time. Throughout most of history, the king was the law for European monarchs. And yeah, I want to subjugate them, so I'm probably just going to make them break their alliances. Because I very much need to recover after that war. That was brutal. And I will probably start integrating Ireland as well. Because that'll take a good while. Really depended on the king, depended on their style of rulership. Generally, it was good etiquette to kneel before the king when you first saw them, and part of that goes back to it's showing you don't have any ill intent for the guy, right? So your king or queen was one of the most likely people to get assassinated, and no, you could have peasants come into the court. They would often petition the king for things. Um, so the king was honestly one of the most likely people in a given kingdom to be assassinated, and it kind of showed that you had no ill intent for him. If you kneeled in him for deference, showed your hands, showed you didn't have any weapons on you before you talked to him, because most kings had trust issues because a lot of people wanted to kill them and take their spot. So it was generally good courtesy, and the kings liked it if you did, and who doesn't want to ingratiate themselves to the king? That said, peasants could be brought before the king if they were a particularly useful person. Um, I mean, most nobles had non-noble craftsmen that they relied on, so like the king had his personal blacksmith who certainly wasn't noble. Oh yeah, and especially if like because a lot of the king's rivals would have been wealthy too, and say you're some duke who is a cousin of the king and has what many would perceive as a claim on the throne. Well, maybe you pay some peasant 10 times what he could ever hope to make laboring away in the fields to stick a knife in the king's neck. Well, he'd probably do that for you. So the king didn't much like it when people came before him and had their hands hidden and were in a position where they could easily stab him. That said, most tyrants, or most good kings, didn't really have to worry about that all that much. It was really much more of an issue for tyrannical, shitty kings. Oh yeah, the king was usually guarded by his knights, and along with a host of like his personal retinues that he would pay himself. Not all of them were noble. Like the king would sometimes have his own collection of non-noble men at arms he would finance. Um, because not every effective soldier was a noble either. You have non-noble sergeants who were basically career soldiers or had much more military experience than other peasant levies who were of considerable use to the nobility. But no, you didn't have to be a noble to serve the king. You didn't even have to, though it generally helped get you an audience with the king if you were a noble. But yeah, so a lot of kingly tradition has to do with not wanting to die. Well, that's interesting. But throughout history, you do have oh yeah, kings were also assassinated very often, especially sometimes good kings. But you do sometimes have kings who are pretty much universally loved by their people. Like actually because we're playing England right now, Alfred the Great is a good example of this. Though he was never fully a king of England, he was a king of Wessex, which was the precursor kingdom to a united England. And he was about as universally loved by his people, both noble and non-noble, as a king could be. And those are the kings that have less to worry about when it comes to assassinations. That's when a king decides, I'm getting too old for this shit. I'm going to abdicate for my heir. And that can actually ease the transition of power in monarchical societies, because one of the biggest problems with monarchies is the transition of power. Because if the king dies without a clear heir, that's when you get civil wars for the throne. So if a king abdicates, he's basically hand-picking his heir. Because he's going to be around during the first part of his successor's rule, which also helps his successor a little bit. The only problem is, it's a bit most people try to. Sometimes, yes, if a king was horribly incompetent or universally hated, oftentimes they would be forced into an early retirement. And then oftentimes they were unceremoniously dealt with a few months later at the end of a knife. I don't know as much about Murad II as I would like, but I'm assuming he was one who was forced to retire. Yes, there are a lot of, and then again, there's some times where an assassination is a bit difficult to suss out. So actually, that's kind of how Diocletian came to power. Diocletian came to power. I am blanking on the emperor he served, even though I'm writing about him for the next episode. Yeah, so again, Diocletian is another prime example of this. So Diocletian may or may not have had a hand in killing the emperor he was serving, and then he did kill that emperor's successor by framing him for the foul play, and he stabbed him to death in front of his troops. But then, in an effort to maintain his tetrarchy system, he abdicated and retired to Croatia, where he became a farmer basically. That said, the Tetrarchy was not long for this world. It was a horribly inefficient system, and the formal split into Eastern and Western Rome was a much better way of handling what Diocletian was trying to do. He's an interesting one, and you'll get to hear about him in my next episode, which will be coming out at the end of the month. So next Friday, if my late night on Sunday brain isn't letting me down. Yeah, that's another thing is I do have a YouTube account. Let me yeah, she was. Elizabeth the First was incredibly popular. If we scroll back all the way up, this is a long chat. Hold on. And actually, you'll find that the monarchs who were popular in their time tend to remain popular after the fact. Like they get remembered as the great or as a king or queen as a symbol of their country moving forward, even long after they're dead. So if you want to see some of my actual podcast stuff, as well as old streams, this is my YouTube. You can also find me on SoundCloud and Podbean under the same name. But every year I do a series, and I also have a. Oh, good night. Thanks for tuning out for the stream. Hope to see you next week. But yeah, every year I do a new series. So my first series was early medieval Europe, which and that series was called From the Ashes of Empires, and it covered the fall of Western Rome. It started in roughly 476, and it ended in 1066/1071, because I really consider both the Seljuk invasion of Anatolia and the Norman invasion of England to be the end of the early medieval period and the start of the High Middle Ages. My second series was called Between the Crescent and the Cross, and I posted that here, and that was on the Crusades, covered the rise of Islam to 1453, focusing particularly on the Middle Eastern Crusades. My current series is on, it's called Paradise Lost, and it's about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, starting with the reign of Marcus Aurelius and ending with the early Byzantine days as the independent Eastern Roman Empire. And I'm about to release episode 4, which covers the crisis of the 3rd century from the perspective of the Persians and the Germans, as well as how the Romans reacted to that in the early reign of Diocletian. And there's also a series that I started doing on Russia, and I got about halfway through it. But at the time, I was starting a new job, and I was going through a lot personally, so I had to abandon that series, and I just kind of lost interest in it. The episodes are up there. I did 7 good episodes on Russia. Also, that is an interesting thing about English monarchies is most of them are imported. I mean, the current House of Windsor is actually German, and they changed the name during World War One to lessen any connection they had to the enemy of England, because originally they were the House of Saxe-Gothenburg, but they changed the name to Windsor, which was the palace they occupied. And there have been many Frenchmen who sat on the throne of England. I mean, yeah. Um, Really, the Welsh are the earliest inhabitants of Great Britain, at least the southern part of it, and their name means foreigner in their own language. So, and actually, King Arthur isn't English, although he's often associated with England. He is British, though. King Arthur is a legend that dates back to the Romano Britons and their resistance against the Anglo Saxon invaders. And the historical basis for King Arthur is an actual guy called Ambrosius Aurelianus, who led the Romano Britons against the Saxons at the Battle of Mons Badonicus, or the Battle of Baden Hill, and he won. So he is very likely the historical basis for King Arthur. Although King Arthur himself remained a symbol for the Welsh that they would be restored to glory, that the red dragon of the Celts would drive out the white dragon of the Saxons and restore southern Britain to Celtic rule. And also, Merlin might have had an actual historical basis, believe it or not, because there was a wild man poet kind of guy who was hanging around at the time who is often attributed as sort of Merlin. I'm glad you like it. I do this stream every Sunday, and I do a second stream on Fridays. But yeah, so and then King Arthur is probably gonna be one of the last ones for the night. But King Arthur is also interesting because he is a British take on a story that shows up throughout European folklore of sort of a king under the mountain, a king who had to be sealed away for whatever reason, but will return to lead his people to glory. And this also shows up in German folklore. Actually, Charlemagne is often the figure in German folklore. He's this king sequestered under a mountain who will return and lead the people to glory. Thank you. Although Arthur is a bit more unique because King Arthur has much deeper lore. Because he's much more heavily mythologized, because he came from a period of history that isn't well documented. So a lot of the stories that arose after his life were easier to get off the ground um, because there was less known about the historical basis for the man. Whereas Charlemagne was around for a period that is very well documented, and a lot more is known about him, so it was harder to mythologize his life after the fact. Yeah, that was another thing about World War One is all the leading monarchs were cousins, or at least most of them. Um, but where was I going with that? So King Arthur remained a Welsh figure until Wales was kind of fully integrated into the Kingdom of England, and then he became a more broadly British symbol. But he was not English to begin with, and he actually his most of his myths he's fighting the English. And that is a historical question that I spent a lot of time thinking about is myths and history. Where do you really draw the line? Because while we know that myths at least most of them, aren't true from sort of an objective factual standpoint. Many people throughout history have acted on myths that they thought were true. So, if people were acting on mythologies they thought were true, if they were inspired by mythologies they thought were true, then perhaps those myths are far more than just stories. So, in all likelihood, Arthur was Christian because the historical basis for King Arthur was as a Romano Briton, and at that point, most of them had been Christianized. Also, yeah, the mythology is a lot more important than a lot of people think it is because throughout a lot of history, people have been acting on things that they thought were true, technically weren't, but they thought they were true, and that inspired great things from other and terrible things in people throughout history. So, if you study a people's mythology, you can better understand that people. You can tell what they valued. You can tell a lot of important things about a people. And I honestly think if you study history, you should also study mythology because it'll give you a fuller understanding of the people and times that you're studying. Because a historical figure is a historical figure. There's some jackass who lived a long time ago, right? But those historical figures can become legends, and those legends can become myths. Also, yeah, sometimes myths are proven true, but and it's myths that you can build a country on. And I go into this in one of my Crusade episodes where I talk about George Washington. A lot of the stories about George Washington aren't necessarily true, or they're exaggerated. But the myth of George Washington is almost more important than the man that was George Washington, because the myth of Washington is more or less what the United States, the mythology of the United States is built on. And a lot of countries have a figure like that where some the stories about them aren't necessarily true, or not all of them, but the myth of the person is more important than the person himself or herself. Where they're almost more powerful after death than they were in life. They can inspire more. They can almost do more for their country acting through others inspired by their myth. So that's why I think historians should also study mythology. Because some of it's completely off the wall, but a lot of mythology is based, at least in part, in things that actually happened. But on that note, I think I'm going to call it for the night. Usually do this for about 2.5 hours. So tune in on Friday. I will more than likely be doing a Crusader Kings stream. And I'm going to continue this one next Sunday. And I'm actually going to title this one because I intend to play this England game all the way up to the end. So let's go with Rural Britannia stream. All right. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. Check out my YouTube for new episodes and everything, and you can also follow me for the latest updates on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Renegade Historian. Have a great night, everybody. See ya.